So Pat Bassfield was supposed to be giving the talk right now, and he went home yesterday quite ill. And so Barbara asked if I could give a talk tomorrow. I said, sure, I can do that. And then I realized that my computer was dead, and I forgot to bring my charger. So we made a deal. If she could find me a charger to charge up my computer, I'd put together a talk. So I did this with one charge on my laptop. So it kind of fizzles out at some point, but we'll see how we can go. I figured in honor of Pat Bassfield, I would talk to you guys about some work. It's work that we've actually been doing for quite a while, and so some of this is kind of old, and my apologies to those of you who've seen parts of this talk before. I've tried to add some updated stuff that my current students are working on as well. But one of the reasons that we're working in this area actually had to do with a great monitoring network that Pat Bassfield and others at the NPCA helped get up and running. And so there is sort of a small tie-in to the talk that you were supposed to be hearing right now. And so I'm going to talk about sediment source reduction at a watershed scale and trying to emphasize the importance of understanding the geomorphic history when you think about watershed management. So we're going to be talking about the Greater Blue Earth River Basin, which is located up here, and kind of bring you up to speed on some a research project that we're working on right now, which goes by the name of CSIR, which stands for the Collaborative for Sediment Source Reduction. And the ultimate goal of the collaborative is to essentially reduce turbidity and fine sediment loading to the Greater Blue Earth River Basin and to the Minnesota River. What the collaborative is not actually going to get to this point, what we're going to try and do is develop a consensus strategy among stakeholders based on the latest and greatest science that we can put together to come up with a strategy to do this. So this is a very large watershed, it's a very complex area. Most of it is agricultural. It's located down here in south central Minnesota. A little bit of it tips into Iowa, so I feel like it's appropriate for this conference. We did actually get into Iowa, just a little bit. There are three main watersheds that drain into the Blue Earth. There's the Blue Earth itself, the Watening, and then this over here is the Sueur Basin. And it's split up into three main tributaries, the Maple, the Cobb, and the Sueur. So those are the kind of the basins that we'll talk about. So why are we working in the Greater Blue Earth River? Well, a wise man once referred to this as the beating muddy heart of the Minnesota River. That was Peter Wilcock, so who I think is a wise man. But if you'll notice, this is a map that shows total suspended solids yield in the Minnesota River by tributary basin. And the Sueur kind of is this glowing pink spot here. It has the highest TSS yields of all the tributaries that drain into the Minnesota. And sort of the Greater Blue Earth River Basin as a whole contributes a disproportionate amount of sediment to the Minnesota. If we were to follow the Minnesota River downstream, we find that it provides 85–90% of the total fine sediment load to the Mississippi River. And if we were to follow this on down to Lake Pepin, which is a naturally dammed lake on the Mississippi, we find that most of that sediment is deposited there. And there's a beautiful archive to look at the history of, in this case, sedimentation over time. So this has been worked up by folks at the St. Croix Watershed Research Station. They've done a very nice study to look at sedimentation in Lake Pepin over time. And you can see that there's been essentially a tenfold increase in the amount of sediment that's deposited into this lake from pre-settlement times or pre-European settlement times to the modern. And so this is intriguing, especially when you consider that most of the sediment comes from Minnesota, and a lot of that sediment comes from the Greater Blue Earth River Basin. We can go one step further and actually look at some radiogenic isotope data to understand where that sediment is coming from. So this is the same plot, but now we've got these red dots, which are meteoric beryllium-10 concentrations. And we have these X's here. Those are decay-corrected lead-210. Both of these are fallout radionuclides. They essentially spike the upper surface of the landscape. And they provide a measure of, if you were to measure the concentration in that source, and then measure the concentration in sediment that's coming out of the rivers, you could actually figure out sort of what proportion of the sediment came from uplands, from areas that are exposed at the surface, and what percentage came from other sources, non-field sources, essentially. Those would be things like high bluffs, for instance. And so that's what these are tracking. Anything that's low means that there's pretty low percentage coming from fields. And as this increases, it means that there's more sediment coming from fields. So we can do a little bit more than just say how much sediment is coming. We can look at where it's coming from. And we see three distinct time periods where we have a pre-settlement condition where most of the sediment actually came from non-field sources. So those would be like near-channel sources. And anyone who's walked around in the rivers of the lower portions of the Minnesota River knows that there's a lot of big bluffs, for instance. So there's a ready source of sediment. Then we have the rise of agriculture, and we see a shift towards a lot of field sediment that's coming off of sort of the newly cleared prairie and wet prairie conditions. And then recently, in the last few decades, sediment yields have stayed very high, but we've seen a shift back towards non-field sediment sources. And so we're kind of in this interesting conundrum in that it looks like a lot of sediment is coming from near channel sources again. And so what do we know at this point? All right, we know that there's a lot of sediment in the Minnesota River. We know that much of it comes from the greater Blue Earth River Basin. We know there's more being deposited now than there was before. And we know that a lot of it comes from near channel sources. Okay, so there's our framework to work with. So the goal of the collaborative, as I said, is to develop a consensus strategy to reduce the amount of fine sediment loading to the greater Blue Earth River Basin. These are some of the questions that we want to try to address in order to do this. We need to know where within the greater Blue Earth River Basin the sediment is coming from. And so to do this, we employ a sediment budget. We want to know why it's coming from there. To understand why it's coming from those sources, you need to know about the geomorphic history as well as the human history of the basin. We would like to know why it has increased over time. We don't actually know if it's increased tenfold, right? That was the depositional signal. The erosional signal could be a little bit different. Bonus points if you can figure out how much it's increased over time. That would give us sort of a background or pre-settlement sediment load. And then lastly, how do we actually achieve sediment reduction in this large watershed? And so this is where the collaborative comes in. So this is a group of stakeholders that we've been meeting with a couple times a year for the last few years. And what we're doing is sort of using their input to help us guide the development of a sediment and water routing model. This is a model that you'll be able to put management options on the landscape and actually look how it changes sediment and water routing to the main stem. We're going to couple that with a decision analysis model. This is where you would add in cost information on different kinds of management options. And so you'd be able to actually run scenarios in real time. And we also do this all with stakeholder input. So we've been involved with a number of stakeholders in these meetings over the years. We're kind of at the point where the sediment routing model is in sort of the beta version, I think I'd put it that way, as is the decision analysis model. And the stakeholders are probably annoyed that they're still beta versions, but we're getting there. So what I'm going to do actually is start here. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background. So I told you some of this talk is old. So that's what happens when you have to pull it together in an hour and 45 minutes of battery time. So we're going to talk a little bit about geomorphic and human history of the basin, a little bit about the sediment budget work that we've been doing, and then kind of talk about these last two. So geomorphic history of the basin. I'm a geomorphologist. I'm a geologist by training. I love the geomorphic history. I think Rob pointed this out very nicely this morning. Anytime you're working on a basin, you have to know what your geomorphic history is, right? This sets the template for everything that's going on. And in order to understand this in the Minnesota River Basin, we have to go back to the end of the last ice age. There was a time when the Laurentide ice sheet was draining primarily through its southern outlet here. So this is Lake Agassiz, or the early version of Lake Agassiz. All of that water was pouring down the Minnesota River Valley and carved a rather deep valley. So if we kind of follow this on down, here's the Minnesota, this is Mankato, and it takes a 90-degree turn. Twin Cities is located up in here. So we're working down here in the greater Blue Earth River Basin. So with all this incision that you get on the main stem Minnesota River, that incision has to propagate up all of the tributaries. And that's why we end up with these deeply incised zones in the lower portions of the basin. So here we are back in the Blue Earth River Basin. This line marks the approximate location of the nick point, the top of that incisional wave that's moving up into these landscapes. And all of the channels below that are incising, okay? So they're actively incising through time. All of this sort of, the valley that you see here wasn't there 14,000 years ago. So we have a beautiful landscape evolution story going on, and it fundamentally dictates the primary sediment sources today and how we would manage them. If we look above the nick zone, we find an area that really has not experienced base level fall at all. And so we have very flat landscapes. This used to be a glacial lake all by itself. And we find channels that are nicely connected with their floodplain. You kind of get erosion on the cut bank side. It's deposited on the point bar side. And things are doing pretty good. We do have some channel widening out here. That's a source of sediment. But otherwise, these rivers are very different than what you get when you go below the nick zone. Now you have high relief, you have deeply incised valleys, you get these bluffs that start appearing that provide a lot of fine sediment. You also have ravines that sort of connect the deep valleys up into the uplands. And remember again, all of this valley has been carved in the last 14,000 years. As you go through the nick zone, you essentially have no floodplain because the river is actively incising, and so it's like it's cutting itself off from its floodplain as it cuts down through time.
You have to get down below the Nick zone into the place that's sort of fully experienced base level fall before the river starts to open back up and get it's an active floodplain. We also have a large anthropogenic disturbance to the landscape. It's not just geomorphology, right? So we've had large-scale conversion of prairie and wet prairie into primarily row crop agriculture. And with that, of course, as many people have mentioned, there's been a wholesale change in the plumbing of the landscape. We've drained the wetlands, we've installed a lot of ditches, and we put a lot of drain tiles in. So a number of people have looked at sort of how this is affecting flows downstream. This is an example of a compilation by Heinz Stefan's group, where they looked at flows in the Minnesota River and see that flows are increasing for low flows, high flows, peak flows, extreme flows. There's just a lot more water in the system. This has to have a feedback on the geomorphology. And in fact, if you look at channel widths, you see they're increasing pretty substantially over time. This is a reach along the Minnesota River, where the river has essentially doubled in size since 1940. So we went back and looked at air photos approximately every decade, not just on the Minnesota, but on a number of tributaries in the area. And these are some of the results from that. You can see these are written down as annual widening rates as a percentage of the total width. So about 0.3% of the width is sort of the rate at which the channels are widening every year. It's a little bit lower as we go below the Nick point, and it's a little bit higher on the Minnesota itself, about 0.5% a year. That's a lot. Okay, so that's sort of the template that we're working in, right? Large-scale geomorphic impact with all the base level fall, large-scale anthropogenic change, both in land use as well as in the plumbing of the system. Okay, and this is where Pat Bassfield comes in here. Okay, and this is one of the reasons that we started working in this area in the first place. There's a beautiful monitoring network set up. This is the Sueur, so this is just a portion of the Blue Earth River Basin. There's a gauge right here at the mouth. There's a gauge at the mouth of each of the 3 main tributaries. And then more importantly, or maybe equally importantly, we'll put it that way, there is a gauge just above the Nick point on all 3 of these channels. And so we have a series of paired gauges where we can look at the amount of sediment coming in from the upper part of the watershed, and then we can see what's moving through this sort of deeply incised zone and what's coming out at the mouth. So we know at the red jacket gauge, that kind of integrates over time. So we have an average of about 225,000 metric tons of sediment per year. This is the paired gauges on the maple. So we see there's about 18,000 metric tons coming into the upper gauge, and it goes up by over a factor of 3, even though the watershed area only increases by about 10% by the time we get down to the lower maple. So there's a huge pickup in sediment as you go through this incised zone. And that repeats itself on the Cobb as well as on the Sueur, although they do have a slightly bigger increase in watershed area. And in fact, if you look not just at the Sueur, not just at the Blue Earth, but at a handful of other basins in the lower Minnesota that also have paired gauges, you can see this pattern of an increase in sediment load as you go through the Nick zone. But it's interesting because it only happens at really high flows. Okay, this is a complicated graph. This was put together by Sejong Cho, who's out at Johns Hopkins University. And what she's trying to show here is the pickup in sediment that you get from the upper gauge to the lower gauge. So she actually went back through gauge records and tried to follow the same packet of water and sediment from the upper gauge downstream to the lower gauge. She paired those two and looked to see, did we get more sediment or did we have the same concentration of sediment, essentially? If it's 0, that means it didn't really pick up any sediment, right? So maybe your watershed area got bigger, your concentration stayed the same, so you have no big increase in sediment. And you'll see that, that's actually what you get at low flows. There's no substantial pickup in sediment. But then you cross some threshold and things sort of blow up. And you get a huge pickup in sediment. And so one of the issues is we have some kind of peak discharge where when we cross over that, those near channel sediment sources really turn on. And this becomes important if we want to figure out how to really turn them off. Okay? So we decided to create a sediment budget. Now this was the slide put together actually for the Sueur sediment budget, but we've since expanded that out into the entire greater Blue Earth River Basin. If you want to put together a sediment budget, you need to enumerate the different sources that are dominant in the system, figure out the extents, figure out the rates at which sediment is eroding from them, incorporate deposition, and put it all together and see what you get. So we decided to throw every tool in the toolbox at this, and that's essentially what we did here. We used the aerial LiDAR data that were available in Blue Earth County. And back then, this was the only LiDAR data available in this area. Now, of course, thank you, state of Minnesota, we have LiDAR data for the entire state. So you can do this anywhere you want. So we used that to map out the extents of bluffs, the extents of ravines. We used it to assist with looking at elevations of channels on either side of the channel banks. We used air photos to get both channel migration as well as bluff erosion. We used repeat terrestrial LiDAR data in order to actually measure bluff erosion rates. And we also used radiogenic tracers to get sort of sediment fingerprinting for upland sediment and other sediment. So a whole bunch of different techniques. And we put them together to develop a sediment budget that was organized around the geomorphic framework of the system, right? We have the Nick zone down here. We have the area above the upper gauge up here. And so we see that there's a huge pickup in sediment in the Nick zone, primarily driven by bluff and bank erosion. Okay, so it's valley excavation. It's different sources than we have above the upper gauge up here. So this is sort of the expansion of that sediment budget out into the Blue Earth River Basin. And this is work that was recently completed by Martin Beavis for his master's. And I know we just had our last poster session, but his poster's right over there. So if you want more information, you can find him. What we see is that overall, the Blue Earth River Basin, the Blue Earth, this part, is actually exporting more sediment than the Sueur. It's just bigger. And so when you yield everything, it drops down a little bit. All three basins are exporting quite a bit. Here are the actual numbers. I'm going to stamp the big word preliminary on this because we're actually still waiting for sediment fingerprinting data for the upland sediment portion of this. But what's important here is that most of the sediment is still coming from these near channel sediment sources. The brown here is bluff sediment. The blue here is, see now I've covered it up. Those are the stream banks. The green is the upland, and the smaller portions, the red little sliver there, are the ravines. Okay, one of the nice things about sediment budgets, right, you can look at it as a pie chart. That's kind of exciting. But really, there's this wealth of data that we collected in order to put together the budget. This is just an example. These are channel migration rates along the Blue Earth, the Watershed, the Sueur, and the Maple. And so you can see there are certain areas where we have really high channel migration rates. And I think it was Mimi who was talking about channel migration rates and areas that were moving really fast. These are moving at over 0.5 meter a year, these red areas in here. And you'll also see they line up very nicely with some of these Pleistocene alluvium channels. So these are places where you have a lot of bed load in the system, and we might expect a more active channel. Okay, so that kind of gets us through the first two questions, and I've already gotten my 5-minute warning, but I didn't get the directions. Does that give me 20 minutes when that runs out? Okay, we'll just assume. I'm just going to keep going here. Okay, so we kind of know where the sediment is coming from. We pretty much know why. It's really tied intimately with the geomorphic history. Why has it increased over time, and how much has it increased? To me, this is one of the most, not maybe the most important, but one of the coolest questions that you could ask. And I'm not going to have time to get into it here. So I'm going to give you a teaser, okay? Remember I said this entire valley has been carved over the last 14,000 years, right? It's brand new. It's left behind fingerprints all over the place, and they're in terraces. So all of these terraces, there are hundreds of them littering the valley, and you can go in and measure the depositional age of the sediment and know where the channel was through time. And then you know how quickly it was incising through time. So we were able to do this. We measured about 24 terraces on the Sueur itself by gathering sediment, terrace sediment, up here and mapping it out with either optically stimulated luminescence or radiocarbon date. So we get an age of deposition. So we can get the incision history. We know how fast the channel's cutting into its bed. We coupled that with some numerical models, with some work with Noah Finnegan out at UC Santa Cruz, and we're able to actually look at the mass coming out of the valley through time. So now we have a pre-settlement erosion rate. And like I said, I don't have time to get into details on this, but trust me, it's about 3 to 4 times lower than the current amount of sediment that's coming out from bluff erosion, bank erosion, and channel incision, which is essentially what this is modeling. So even though a lot of our sediment is coming out with near channel sediment sources, it's a lot more now than it was in the past. There's some future work that's going on that another master's student is working on, actually trying to look at channels that are preserved on terraces to see if we can measure paleo-channel geometry and paleo-channel discharge. And her results are so preliminary, I didn't even put the numbers up here. But fundamentally, the discharge has increased quite a bit from what we can see so far. Okay, so we know that this is the sediment budget, sort of the pre-settlement budget. This is the modern budget. So you can see that back then, a lot of sediment was coming from near-channel sediment sources. This fits with what we see in Lake Pepin. It's about a factor of 3 to 4 lower than what we have today. Whoa, okay, so I am going to summarize this. If most of the sediment was coming from near-channel sources, how do we reduce the loading there? Okay, and that's sort of where the scissor project is going. How do we actually deal with this? There's a lot of best management practices out there that people have worked on for ravines and for upland sediment, but this is a conundrum. Do we actually sit there and start sticking Band-Aids on the bluffs to try and slow those down and stabilize those? Or do we actually look at the heart of the problem and start trying to reduce peak flows? So this is work that we're doing right now as part of the scissor project to try and put some numbers to that. How effective is it to stabilize the banks. We have measurements of the bank erosion or bluff erosion on all these different bluffs throughout the basin, so we could actually start to look at how much does it cost, how much sediment reduction do you get. Alternatively, if we were to try to hold water back on the landscape, which is sort of at the heart of the problem right now, we have a lot more water moving through the landscape, then how successful are those going to be at reducing peak flows? And remember, we got to reduce peak flows to get things on the other side of this threshold so that we're not getting this huge pickup in sediment as the water moves through the lower basin. All right, so this is just, we have two parallel monitoring or modeling projects going on right now to try and look at hydrologic management options on the landscape. So this is work that Nate Mitchell is doing. His poster is over there too. You can find him and get more information. But he's trying to look at potential water retention sites. Yes, there's a lot of them. These are topographic depressions on the landscape. It's a really flat landscape. And it used to have a lot more water that just kind of hung out in these topographic depressions. We don't tend to use the word wetland restoration, in part because our stakeholders were really against that. And we said, okay, well, let's just think about them as temporary water impoundment sites for now. Wetland restoration provides all sorts of other ancillary benefits and all sorts of other strengths. So for now, if you were going to hold water on the landscape, does it make sense to hold it up here, farther away from the mouth, or down here closer to the mouth? Where do you get the bigger bang for your buck? How much do you actually have to restore in order to get some reduction in peak flows? These are some complicated but really cool results that Nate can tell you all about. Up here, the number 1 means you have no sediment reduction. And so what he's showing is that as you go this way, you're restoring more and more and more water retention sites in the basin. And as you go this way, you're increasing your hydraulic connectivity in your model. And so it's very sensitive to the hydraulic connectivity at the base of your water retention site, which presumably is controllable by putting tiles in there and having the water go somewhere else. I don't know. But so it's kind of sensitive. This is one modeling effort. We have another modeling effort that's going on that's looking at the LIDAR data, USLE data, and trying to develop sort of sediment delivery ratios throughout the landscape to try and look at how best management practices would affect that. And this is when I had 5 more minutes left on my computer, and I think I'm out of time. So I thought I'd just throw out 2 very general conclusions that I kind of want you to take away from this. And the first one up here, we talk a lot about work in the stream. But fundamentally, sometimes what's wrong with the stream is that there's too much water in it right now. I think people who work in urban systems are very aware of this. But we have to remember that in the agricultural systems as well. And hydrologic management options should be on the table as much as bluff stabilization options. It may come out, as you sort through everything, that it's not as cost effective, but it's still something that people need to be aware of. And the last one, because I am a geomorphologist, I have to toot this horn, right? The geomorphic setting, I think, is essential in providing the framework for managing this system. If you didn't know what you were working in, you could come up with all sorts of ideas to solve it that I think would take you down the wrong path. And I won't name any names, but I did go to a conference once where someone was talking about these basins. They were trying to do some work in them, and they said, all these rivers are disconnected from their floodplains, and so we need to reconnect them to the floodplains. Well, they're incising rivers. They are totally disconnected from their floodplains. And so that is true, but maybe we shouldn't be spending our money trying to reconnect them to the floodplains in systems that are essentially incising and cutting themselves off from their floodplains as they go naturally. So always keep the geomorphic setting in mind. And then lastly, thank you to all the people who worked on this who I didn't put their name on here. But there are many of them, several of them who are in here. And I can take questions.
Okay, we have time for one question.
Thanks, Karen.
I guess I'm close by. So one question, to address the hydrologic issue, he's saying he's an ag land on production. Is that right? So there's a trade-off when you're looking at bluff stabilization versus hydrologic options?
Yeah, so that's why we aren't using the word wetland, because when you're actually restoring a wetland, you're taking ag land out of production. We've been discussing with our stakeholders the possibility of having temporary impoundments, or things that would be able to be impounded certain times of the year and not all of the year. So areas that are not productive anyways, because they're hard to drain. And so I think there might be some engineering solutions that would allow people to not take the land out of production forever, maybe temporarily, or maybe not completely at all. So I'd like to think there's options out there, but yes, that is a possibility. That anytime we take ag land out of production, it's challenging. Especially here, this is some of the best farmland in the state of Minnesota.
All right.